supporting us with the technical arrangements for the meeting from the background. We are live streaming on YouTube, and we encourage all of you tuning in to use the comment section to share your thoughts or questions throughout the event. And we'll do our best to bring some of your questions into the Q&A at the end of the session. So as you might know, today we are discussing Citizen Marx, Republicanism and the Formation of Karl Marx Social and Political Thought, an important new book by Bruno Leipold, published by Princeton University Press. A little bit of a housekeeping and how we are going to do it today. So we'll begin with opening remarks from the author, Bruno, followed by reflections from two distinguished discussants. We are super happy to have you here, Geneviève and Nicolas Versailles. Bruno will then respond to their comments and will open the floor to further discussion and questions from our viewers. So let me first introduce our author. Bruno Leipold is a political theorist and historian of political thought. He specializes in Karl Marx, the Republican tradition, and theories of popular democracy. He is currently a fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, and will be taking up the role of assistant professor in political theory there this September. Before joining the LSE, Bruno was a fellow at the New Institute in Hamburg, a Max Weber fellow at the European Institute in Florence, and a postdoctoral fellow in political theory at the Justitia Amplificata Center for Advanced Studies at the Goethe University Frankfurt and the Free University of Berlin. Citizen Marx is his first book and already promises to reshape long-standing debates about Marx's engagement with politics and democracy. Bruno, we're thrilled to have you with us. Please go ahead with your opening remarks. And you also have some slides, so please do share them.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Alexandra, for that introduction and for setting up this wonderful panel. A huge thanks to you, and thanks so much to Geneviève and Nicolas for taking the time. I'm very honored. I'm a big fan of both of your books on freedom and domination, and so I couldn't imagine a more perfect panel for this online discussion. So thanks so much, you two, for taking the time. Let me just share a couple of slides just to give a short introduction to the book. Is that all okay, Alexandra? Great. Okay, so where should I start? Well, I'll start with the title of the book. Why is it called Citizen Marx? Well, so essentially, this is a reference to the fact that in the 19th century, all radicals called each other by this honorific citizen. It's kind of an egalitarian practice that goes back to the French Revolution. So it's a replacement, an egalitarian replacement for things like lord and duke and so forth. Instead, every person becomes a citizen. And that's also true in the 19th century. So it takes a long time for citizen to be replaced by comrade, actually. So even among socialists, they all call each other citizen. And that is even true of Marx and Engels. And so, as you can see here, this is the first English translation of the Communist Manifesto, which appropriately enough appears in the journal The Red Republican. And there, Marx and Engels are introduced by the editor as citizens Charles Marx and Frederick Engels. Now, this translation is, it's a very interesting translation. It's not the one that we're familiar with. It's carried out by a very interesting early Scottish feminist and Republican and socialist, Helen Macfarlane. It's a really great translation in a lot of ways, but it's unfortunately only known for one thing today, which is that rather than the very famous opening line, "A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism," in Macfarlane's version, it's "a frightful hobgoblin stalks throughout Europe." Which is unfortunate because it's otherwise a very great translation. And I do talk a little bit about Helen Macfarlane's own work in the book as like an interesting mixture of republicanism and socialism. Okay, that's just a little bit of introduction. So what am I arguing in the book? So the most central argument that I'm getting at in the book is that if we want a proper understanding of Marx's social and political thought, we need to understand the formative role that republicanism played on his thought. And I mean that influence in both a kind of positive, familiar sense, so the ways in which we can kind of positively show the causal relationships between republicanism and Marxist thought, but also in a negative sense, the way in which Marx defined himself against existing republicans. And so just to give you a sense of what I mean by this influence, it's helpful to contrast that with a different kind of very popular way of presenting Marxist thought. And that's an image that is given to us by Lenin in 1913. And he tells us that the three formative influences on Marx's thought are one, German philosophy, two, French socialism, and three, English political economy. Now that is a very memorable setup, and but it's kind of problematic in a number of different ways. It kind of weirdly suggests that any of these disciplines are kind of related to just a single country, as if, for example, the tradition of English socialism didn't influence Marx. But from the perspective of my book, what it really misses is the fact that there is also the sort of formative role of European republicanism on Marx's thought. And that's what my book is trying to get across, this influence in both this negative and a positive sense. Now, for the listeners on YouTube, maybe now is a good moment to kind of say what I mean by republicanism. And I'll just take a couple of minutes on that. So as I suppose republicanism has so many different meanings today. It can mean the US Republican Party, the French Republicans, Republicans in Britain, and so on. This is very all related to what I mean, but in some ways quite different. And so what I really mean by republicanism is what republicanism meant in the 19th century at the time in which Marx was writing. And republicanism at that point was a real political movement and associated political ideology. So in the same way that we have liberals and conservatives and socialists today, in the 19th century, as this cartoon from 1850 shows quite nicely, you have Republicans on the left and liberals in the center and conservatives on the right. So republicanism is the left-wing ideology of the 19th century. And it takes a very long time for socialism to displace republicanism, in part by integrating and rejecting various aspects of it. And so what did republicanism mean? Well, while, let's say, conservatives at the time on the right wing wanted to maintain absolute monarchies without a parliament, no controls on the king, Republicans were radicals who wanted a democratic republic with universal suffrage and extensive participation tied together by a particular idea of freedom, Republican freedom as the absence of arbitrary power. Whereas liberals in the center were a compromise between these positions and opposed the democratic demands of Republicans. And that's the really central thing to understand what is different between Republicans and liberals in the 19th century. So at least at this historical moment. And this is what I'm comparing Marx with, this contrasting political movement, a live political movement at the time that is also competing for working class support. So that's what I mean by republicanism in the book. Let me give you a little bit more of a sense of what I'm arguing in detail in the book. So the book has three let me just go back again. Has three structuring periods. First is Marx's early republicanism. So in the first part of the book, I set out the way in which Marx just straightforwardly was a Republican at the beginning of his life, believed in all of these various democratic principles that I've just mentioned, and I set out the way in which that informed his early journalism, his critiques of the various aspects of arbitrary power in Prussia, whether that's feudal legislators, government censors, and so forth, and the kind of underlying views of freedom that Marx used to criticize those institutions. Including then also in his critique of Hegel, where he sets out a kind of Republican critique of Hegel's liberal constitutional monarchy, arguing it that doesn't provide nearly enough scope for citizen participation and control over their representatives and bureaucrats, Marx wanting that to be carried out by the people themselves. I then, in the second part of the book, trace the way in which Marx transitions from that republicanism to communism. And what's really important to me is that transition to communism is not simply a rejection entirely of his environment republicanism. I set out the ways in which Marx integrated his republicanism into his communism. Politically, I look at the way in which Marx integrates those commitments to democracy and politics into his communism, which is not to be taken for granted because I set out the ways in which existing communists at that time were very anti-democratic and anti-political. So Marx's Republican communism differentiates himself from that. And on the social side, I look at the way in which Marx carries over that belief in freedom as the absence of arbitrary power to provide a critique of the domination of capitalism. So you get a move from an extension from the political to the social ideas of freedom. And so those ways, republicanism, I think, is very important to understanding Marx's communism in those periods. But I also set out how in that middle period, some of the more radical elements of Marx's republicanisms disappear into the background. So this kind of vision of a very extensive set of political participation and control over representatives disappears a little bit in this period, and we get a more simplified account of what democracy means. And that only comes back in the third period of Marx's life, where in response to the Paris Commune, this kind of example of working class self-rule inspires Marx to think more deeply about what political institutions are necessary for bringing about communism. And he returns to some of his earliest views about how you need to be able to really control your representatives and the bureaucrats to really have a state that is under the people's control. And that is essential to bringing about communism. And so in those ways, I then show how he comes to a fuller synthesis between republicanism and communism. So that is the broad scope of the argument of the book. I'll just end now with two final thoughts about what I hope that the book provides a little bit more broadly beyond a picture of Marx. So one is about this relationship between politics and social emancipation, which I think is, quite nicely shown by this French cartoon from 1890, where you can see these socialist futures depicted in the Republican terms of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Marx is here pointing the way as the prophet to that future, which is not really how I like to see Marx. It's a little bit too dogmatic, but it's helpful that he's in the photo. But you can see that that social future is reached via these political commitments in the middle, via universal suffrage and referendum, which is not something that Marx and Engels believed in, but in the 1890s, a lot of socialists were very keen on. The point is there that the way in which the essential nature of political institutions and radical democratic political institutions to reaching that socialist future, compared to what I think has often been a sort of instrumentalism in socialist thought and its treatment of politics. And that's what I don't think that Marx had that view. And I hope that that provides something of a resource for contemporary socialists and so people on the left to thinking about the relationship between politics and social emancipation. Secondly is about the question of freedom. So I would say that unfortunately, one of the very common ways of seeing Marx's relationship with freedom is something like this sign, or the way he's often depicted in public discussions as an enemy of freedom. And that I think it could not be further from the truth. I think freedom is Marx's central political commitment. And he means many different things by that. But one thing that he means, and I think has been neglected so far, is this Republican idea as freedom as non-domination or the absence of arbitrary power. And I think that idea of freedom connects a lot of our commitments as the way to oppose capitalism and might provide a language in which we might articulate some of our oppositions today in a grounded and complete way. So that is a short, I hope not too long, Alexandra, overview of what the book does and what I hope it might say outside of it as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Bruno, for this really insightful introduction to your book. So let me now then introduce our first discussant, Dr. Geneviève Roussillé. Geneviève is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Duke University. Before joining Duke, she taught at the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on freedom in contexts of inequality, with particular attention to Republican, feminist, and democratic theory. Her most recent book, Sharing Freedom, Republicanism and Exclusion in Revolutionary France, was published by Cambridge University Press last year. She also co-edited the volume Republicanism and the Future of Democracy. Geneviève, we look forward to hearing your thoughts. Please, the floor is yours.
So first, I'd like to begin by saying that Citizen Marx is an excellent book. It proposes an original and compelling perspective for reading and reinterpreting Marx. It situates Marx's writings within their historical context, but without reducing them to it. The historical work is precise, it's detailed, nuanced, and I learned just a great deal about Marx, about texts that I had not read before, or texts that I had read, but without context, and so I could not quite understand them as well as I did after reading Bruno's book. So I would say that as a fellow historian of political thought, I was really impressed, Bruno, by your capacity to operate at several levels of complexity in each chapter. And I know by experience that it's very difficult to do because you maintain one general big thesis about Marx that's accessible to, I would say, a general reader. But at the same time, in each chapter, you do engage with the very specific scholarship on each of these texts. And the scholarship on Marx, of course, is immense. But you do so without always showing it, too clearly, so that it's fantastic to read, because the reader follows you and feels that, okay, this is the very enlightening interpretation of this text, and I do not need to read the rest of the discussion. But it's very well done, I would say. And you also do that while engaging with scholarship in different languages, which is also very difficult. So congratulations on that. I would say this is a remarkable achievement. So substantially, I'm just going to say a few things that Bruno already presented. The book shows the extent to which Marx was influenced by Republican ideas and contributed to the transformation of republicanism by weaving it into communism. I would say, I think it's fair to say that the idea that there were Republican threads within Marx's work is not new, nor is the idea that Marx is a theorist of freedom. But the book is the first real attempt at presenting the evidence that there is such, the evidence that Marx engages extensively with republicanism throughout his writing career. So in that sense, the book is really original. And an associated feature of the book, and Bruno mentioned it, is that Marx is presented as a political thinker and someone for whom political institutions matter to the realization of freedom. And that's an important corrective to the common reading of Marx as aiming for the end of politics. So I found all that quite convincing. One thing that this book also does, and this is maybe not as clear for other readers, but it responds to problematic views of the neo-Republican scholarship. And this is something that other people have done, like Alex Gorevich and myself. So the neo-Republican scholarship has spread the belief that somehow Republicanism disappeared at the turn of the 18th century, and it did not exist in France and in Germany after that time. Of course, from the point of view of historians, it's completely absurd. It's a very strange thesis, in fact. But at the philosophical level, you can understand it. I think what these neo-Republican authors are saying is that after, like during the revolution and after, those who call themselves Republicans are transforming the Republican tradition so much that they are not faithful at all to the core commitments of the classical tradition. So I think that Citizen Marx engages somewhat with this question, but only transversally. And I think this is smart, actually. I thought that you respond to that, but without having to go through all the details of the discussion. So I want to say that I'm not a specialist of Marx by any stretch of the imagination, and I do not have skin in the Marxist game. So I'm going to leave that to Nicholas, if that's okay. But I do have some thoughts about Marx republicanism. So I'm going to share them and transform them into questions so that you can tell us a bit more about your book. So let me start first with your description of the Republican tradition. So you said that you present it as it is at the time of Marx. And I think that's the right move, because if you had wanted to engage with the previous tradition, you would not have been able, I think, to write a book that would have been less than 1,000 pages. So post-revolutionary republicanism has some odd characteristics. And I do agree with your description. One of them is that something you insist on, and it is that republicanism means democracy, and democracy, republicanism, at the beginning of the 19th century. I agree with this. I think it is a heritage of the revolution. Maybe here, in fact, we have a bit of a disagreement, because I think you say somewhere in the book, or maybe I heard you say in an interview, that you believe that the distinction between democracy and republicanism before the revolution is exaggerated. I disagree with you. I think it's not exaggerated, but I think that Republicans usually associate their ideas with self-government, but self-government and democracy are two very distinct concepts. So anyway, democracy just after the revolution is a rather vague concept in the Republican parlance. And you said that in the book, to be fair. It means the endorsement of universal suffrage. It can also mean the notion of popular sovereignty, which itself can be more or less vague because sometimes it's just notion of sovereignty, sometimes it's sovereignty on government, sometimes it means mandat imperatif, sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes it's just also an oppositional term, and that's also something you said in your introduction. And when it's an oppositional term, it's not analytically very precise. And so my first question, that's something you could say more today, is can you explain how Marx, as a Republican thinker, who is also a democratic thinker, transforms the Republican understanding of democracy, which I think is a rather imprecise term at the beginning of the 19th century. So could you say more about that and about how I understand you have different phases in Marx, but I wonder if you think there is one concept at any point that is more analytically precise or convincing. An additional question about this, about democracy. So before the French Revolution, Republicans are very concerned with democracy because they think that the people can be dominating. So the source of domination does not mean it's not only the king, it's any kind of group that asserts its power and cannot be controlled. So it can certainly be the majority. It can certainly be the people understood as the whole people or just the worse off. And so the fight against domination would also be the fight against the tyranny of the majority or the dictatorship of the proletariat. And so I was wondering if you could say more about this, about whether you think that Marx completely abandons this part of the Republican tradition, this worry that the people could become dominating and that therefore there needs to be some institutions that prevent this domination. Or whether you think that it just integrates it, and maybe I would like you to tell us more about how. My third question is about two other Republican concepts that get importantly transformed during the revolution and that then Marx picks up. It's freedom and independence. I take it that there are two moves that occur conceptually during the revolutionary period and that Marx inherits. The first is this idea: in order to be free, one has to be part of an active sovereign. And second, in order to be free, it is not enough not to be dominated, but you also need not to dominate. I think we find already this idea in Rousseau, but that's a period where there's quite a transformation because you cannot have anymore the Republican ideas that you find in John Locke, if you take him to be a Republican, or Algernon Sidney, with this idea that I can be a free man and have actually slaves and servants. And maybe it would be the case that I need to have a wife and servants and all that in order to be free because they are the conditions of my own independence. So the implications of the first principle is that it is unclear that freedom can remain a negative concept. And the implication of the second principle is that it is unclear that non-domination can require independence. Let me say something about the first one. When you are describing a Marx understanding of freedom, you really insist on freedom as non-domination as a negative concept. But it's quite clear that Marx, in a lot of different passages, also has a positive conception. And that is completely unsurprising because he inherits anyway this kind of issue. And so I understand strategically why you would want to do that, because it's more approachable, more attractive for contemporary readers. But as a historian of political thought, I was a bit surprised that you would do that, because I don't think that Marx maintains this negative conception of freedom as non-domination. And so I was wondering if you could maybe explain why you made that choice. And on the second principle, so Marx inherits the destruction of the association of freedom as non-domination and independence, which is characteristic of the classical Republican tradition. You explain that, and you have a lot of passages in the book where you present that and the evolution of this thought. So in order not to be dominated, it is necessary to be in relation of mutually beneficial interdependence rather than independence. And the reason is normative, but it's also sort of descriptive and factual. And you explained that. You said for Marx, the technological changes in production means that it is just not possible to have a world of independent property owners. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the analytical structure of this conception of mutually beneficial interdependence and how it relates to freedom. And I understand that there are probably different moments in Marx's thought, but I would be interested in understanding more analytically how it works. My last point. So you focus very much on two aspects of republicanism, of the Republican tradition. So the theory of freedom as non-domination and the conflation of republicanism with democracy. And you kind of downplay other aspects. And I was wondering, I mean, maybe it's just a strategic choice. And again, I understand that you cannot talk about everything. But there are some elements of Marx that are quite distinctive and completely heterogeneous from the Republican tradition, like, for instance, his understanding of labor and how labor contributes to the realization of the self. Like, I think that's completely alien to the Republican tradition. So I was wondering if you want to say something about your choices here, maybe methodological choices. But I also wonder about another aspect. So in the 19th century, the one very important enterprise of Republicans, for instance, in France, is public education. And it's not just a policy issue, it's actually normatively very important, because for Republicans, it's very important to have citizens who are epistemically qualified, who are capable of making good decisions, because if they can, then the Republican democracy is not going to survive. And I didn't see in your book very much about that. And I was wondering maybe why, and if it is because Marx is not really interested in that question. So I was just wondering what we could make of that aspect of republicanism or non-republicanism of Marx. So again, thank you for this wonderful book. I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, Geneviève, for your comments. Before giving a chance for Bruno to respond, let us listen to the comments of our second discussant, Dr. Nicolas Versailles. Nicolas is Associate Professor in Practical Philosophy at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, with an academic background that bridges economics and political philosophy. Prior to his current role, he taught at several universities, including Leiden, US Leuven, KU Leuven, and Cambridge. His most recent book, Exploitation as Domination, was published by Oxford University Press in 2023. Nicolas has also held fellowships at Aarhus, Princeton, and Harvard. Since 2019, he has led the Inequality Against Freedom project, which explores the relationship between social inequality and individual liberty. Nicolas, the floor is yours. Please deliver your remarks.
Thanks very much, Alexandra, and please interrupt me if you can't hear me well. And also thanks to CEU for creating this venue where we can all discuss Bruno's book. So I was thinking, what a fitting venue to discuss, the academic refugee and emigre, Karl Marx, who was evicted from Prussia, from Paris, from Brussels before he found his home in London. And I say this, as you know, that this is CEU is a perfect venue for discussing this because CEU academics have been the object of persecution by the Orban government, which forced part of the university into exile in Vienna. So the Hungarian government and governments like it have put the defense of academic freedom back on the agenda once more. So here we are. Now, Bruno's book, wonderful book, erudite and balanced, but also funny and engaging, puts individual freedom front and center, I think, in Marx's thought. And I agree with the central claim of the book, which is that republicanism, European republicanism, is at the forefront of Marx's thought. And in fact, I might even go further and say that Lenin was wrong to include French socialism. That doesn't mean very much. But what is relevant and what I think Bruno's book shows makes a very compelling case for is for even replacing, not just adding, but replacing French socialism with the Republican tradition. But I want to quibble with three issues in the book, which might provide an avenue for discussion. Geneviève has already touched upon a couple of these things. The first thing is about the relationship between communism and republicanism, which is at the heart of Leipold's book. So one way to distinguish between communism and republicanism is to think of the former in terms of unalienated production and the latter in terms of undominated production. It is alienation on this view that does the normative work for communism and domination that does the work for republicanism. And Leipold shows, I think, very convincingly that this juxtaposition is incorrect, both conceptually, but also as a matter of Marxian exegesis. So Leipold argues that republicanism provides a normative grounding for dominated labor, so arbitrary power over alien productive agency, which is also the ground, or a ground, for alienated production. So communism and radical republicanism, at least, do not part ways at the level of fundamental normative commitment. The main disagreement between 19th century Republicans and communists is at the level of social theory and focuses on the desirability of private property in the means of production. So roughly speaking, radical Republicans think that emancipated production requires the universalization of property, whereas communists think it requires its abolition. Now, I want to quibble with Leipold's interpretation of this juxtaposition. So Leipold, in an important passage from, quotes an important passage from the Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844, where the old man says, if man relates to his own activity as an unfree activity, then he relates to it as an activity in the service, under the domination, the coercion, and the yoke of another man. End quote. Now, two things seem to me to follow from this. The first seems to be that all unfreedom, for Marx, involves constraint that is in some sense created by other agents or groups of agents. So the idea that Marx is thinking here impersonal domination seems to me inapposite. And I will return to this in a second. The second implication, however, is that unsatisfied need as such is not a problem for Marx, unless it can be shown to undermine someone's freedom. So in the passage I just cited, and there's plenty of passages like that in the early writings, but also later on, Marx does not say that dominated labor is merely sufficient for unfree activity. He says it is necessary for it. So unsatisfied need that does not bear on freedom is not as such problematic. Robinson Crusoe, for one, is never unfree, even if his needs go unsatisfied. So although Leipold may be right to claim that non-domination does not exhaust Marx's understanding of free labor, I think I can't follow him in thinking that unsatisfied need renders you unfree in addition to the absence of domination. So I think a corollary of this is that alienation is relevant for Marx only insofar as it bears on someone's freedom. That's one thing we might discuss. The second thing we might discuss is Leipold's discussion in Citizen Marx of what he calls these three levels of capitalist domination. There's the level of personal or personalized domination, which is the dominion of the capitalist in the capitalist workplace. There's structural domination, which is the dominion of capital over labor in the context of the labor market, which is facilitated by control over the means of production, which enables the capitalist to extract a profit from the surplus that the workers produce. And finally, Leipold says there's a third level, and he calls this, as I said before, impersonal domination. So Leipold says that the impersonal domination of the market subjects all of society to a form of rule over which no one is master. Now, I agree with Leipold that Marx sometimes talks like this, especially when drawing parallels between capitalist and religious fetishism. But he never uses the term impersonal domination, And to ascribe to him the thought of impersonal domination is, I think, to ascribe to him an incoherent idea, an incoherent idea that many people have ascribed to him, Postone, Heinrich, and others. But charity, if that thought is incoherent, charity would require us to find another interpretation of these passages. And so impersonal domination in my book is an incoherent idea because it implies that there can be dominatorless domination. That is domination without dominators. And there can't be domination without dominators any more than there can be murder without murderers. And not only does the grammar of domination entail dominators, but the mere fact that certain features of our social world are uncontrolled or democratically unchosen does not make them the source of injustice or domination. So the impersonality of public opinion or of unchangeable constitutional provisions may be perfectly acceptable, indeed welcome features of our social world. So just to provide some Marxian background to this thought, in Capital, Volume 1, Marx repeatedly describes commodity exchange as a born leveler and cynic. A corollary of that leveling is that markets make kings and workers equals as commodity owners. That does not mean that capitalist markets, especially labor and credit markets, are off the hook, but it does mean that the sheer impersonality of markets, as long as we're talking non-capitalist markets, is not a vice, it's their signal virtue. So that's, I think, a quibble that really made my reading of certain parts of the book almost painful to go through. Because I agreed so much with the rest of it. So I thought, oh no, why does he want to go there? And then finally, the last thing we might discuss is Marx's constitutionalism. So one of the contributions of Leipold's book, I think, is to show how deep and extensive Marx's lifelong engagement with constitutionalism was. So looking back at the Civil War in France, so Marx's commentary on the Paris Commune, it is remarkable how consistent and steadfastly committed Marx is, both to universal, so manhood, suffrage, and to the idea of representation through public offices. So what's remarkable there is that Marx never fails to distinguish between representation as tracking the interests of the people through some public office, as opposed to representation through, likeness between represented and representative. So the very idea of restricting universal suffrage by class origin would have seemed completely alien to him. So in Marx's view, even Nancy Pelosi can promote your interests as a worker, especially if she's under a mandate. And I mention this because Leipold's picture shows Marx to be committed to universal suffrage, both for its intrinsic value and for its contribution to class struggle. And it also shows that how difficult, if not malintentioned, it is to read Marx and Marx's discussion of representation in the Civil War in France in the way Lenin reads him in The State and Revolution 50 years later. So it's very difficult to shake off the impression that Lenin has gone completely wrong, whether intentionally or not, in how he reads that foundationally important text for understanding Marx's politics, not his critique of political economy, not his general philosophy, but his politics and his engagement with republicanism, and therefore his account of communism. So thanks very much for your attention, and Bruno for writing such a wonderful book.
Thank you, Nicholas. And thank you again to both discussants for your remarks and deep engagement with Bruno's book. A reminder for those of us following on YouTube, you can use the comment section if you have any questions that you also would like the discussants and Bruno to reflect on. And now I'd like to invite Bruno back to respond to the discussants' points.
Well, thank you so much, Geneviève and Nicholas. I think your comments show just how nicely chosen this panel has been. You've really covered a huge range of issues of the book, and both on the Republican side and the Marx side. And I'm very grateful. And I'm now going to try my best to give a half-coherent response to these very intelligent questions that I think I'm actually going to need to think a little bit more about as well. So Geneviève had four main comments: one about republicanism and democracy, one about people and dominate and whether they can dominate, third about the two other concepts about freedom, Republican freedom, about positive freedom and independence, and then fourth, a question about some other Republican concepts that are not addressed. So let me go through those in order, and then I'll move over to Nicholas's comments after that. And how long, Alexandra, should I speak for, roughly?
Well, I think we have time, so 10, 15 minutes is totally fine. But I think, yeah, we have time, so do feel you can respond the way you feel comfortable.
All right, well, cut me off when I start rambling, okay?
Okay.
All right, so the first point about Geneviève had about republicanism and democracy. And so yeah, I was glad that it seems that Geneviève and I have a broadly similar view of what republicanism is and what makes 19th century republicanism different, but still related to what came on previously. I think you made a small point about whether, was I saying about democracy being exaggerated its death beforehand, or like its element beforehand? I guess I merely had meant to say that if the way I would see it is that 19th century republicanism is democracy, and if we was to use a simple formula, pre-19th century republicanism is either aristocratic republicanism or democratic republicanism. Again, to use a somewhat simple formula. I can see you cringing. I'm trying to simplify a little bit. And what I meant to say was that I think that the aristocratic wing of republicanism in its pre-revolutionary period has been given too much weight, and that not enough has been written also about there being some democratic elements to that earlier tradition as well. I was thinking in particular just of Annelien de Dijn's work, has done some nice work on the way in which democracy was used by some, let's say, Dutch Republicans in the 17th century and things. I just think that there's a tendency to always tell the most elitist elements of the Republican story. So it's always, the Federalists, not the Anti-Federalists. It's the parliamentarians, not the levelers, this kind of thing. And I think that that's the kind of tendency that I was trying to maybe just slightly push back on. But I think we agree on the broad narrative of the 19th century republicanism, what makes it quite different in this sense. And then and I agree with your point that self-government is not democracy as well. I think that's actually a very useful way to think about what republicanism might mean trans-historically, perhaps, to say its relationship is more to self-government and how that concept is understood. And so then you ask, then what do I think that is Marx's relationship to that Republican conception of democracy? How does it transform it? Well, I mean, I guess, you noted that, that there's different stages to that, what Marx has to say. So I think, what he talks about democracy in some of his earliest writings with Hegel, it has a very kind of specific notion about a reconciliation between different spheres, that our public lives can be like our private lives, and it has a kind of almost Hegelian aspect to it. I don't want to talk too much about that because I think that can really take us down the wrong track. I guess I want to talk more about, I think that he takes over for all of his life, the more limited Republican understanding in the 19th century, which is that it means universal suffrage and equal civic rights in an institutional way. I think that's just what it means throughout, right? But there is, I think, what I would say in terms of the structure of my book, it's only in the, let's say, in response to the Paris Commune, when he says at one point that the Commune supplied the Republic with really democratic institutions. And so he uses that term democratic, and I think he's there saying that there's actually got to be something a little bit deeper about it. And there I think he's actually connecting to what I think most Republicans were saying at the time, that simple universal suffrage would not be enough. You mentioned the imperative mandate and so forth. And so there I think that he in some ways comes back to a deeper Republican conception, or 19th century Republican conception of democracy. But I don't think I fully answered your point there, so I'm very happy to come back to that. Secondly, you raised this point about a traditional Republican concern is, can the people be dominating themselves? Can they be their own source of dominating power? And I think it's fair to say that this is not a huge concern of Marx himself. That's certainly not very extensive writing on his own part. But I think it'd be wrong to think that Marx doesn't have concerns, just thinks of, let's say, imbuing some central authority with all power in some sense, right? That is, of course, not his constitutional thought, and certainly something that I tried to push back against. He's, as we know, very critical of the executive, of presidential power. So when he criticizes the separation of powers, it's not because of some belief in some grand central power. He does think that there needs to be different centers of power. And I would say that his defense of things like the imperative mandate and the recall are also ways in which he doesn't want, um, let's say, the people's representatives to have kind of complete power either, that they should be kind of constantly controlled again by the people. But I would say it's fair to say it's not a huge concern of Marx's democratic thought. I think his concern is much more about tyranny of the minority, right? That is his central concern when it comes to thinking about democracy. You then asked about these two, so about a little bit more detail about freedom as non-domination, this idea of freedom, and talked about two aspects. You want to ask me more about to think a little bit more about the positive side and what independence means. And I've got to say, so here I really wish I'd had access to your book before I finished my book, because I think this would have been a lot clearer in mine, because I think you very nicely set this out in your book about the ways in which there is a kind of also a positive aspect to the Republican conception as well. And I think that would have been clearer in my own discussion as well. So maybe I'll say a little bit, let me start with the positive side of things here. So I guess I would certainly say, and what I do try to say in the book, is that I don't think freedom as non-domination exhausts everything that Marx has to say about freedom. I think that that is certainly the case, that Marx has multiple conceptions of freedom, and one might even wish to analytically reconstruct how they all fit together into some grand coherent picture. Though I think that that would be a certain kind of history of political thought that I'm not doing in this book, right? Because that would really involve reconstruction in any sense, because Marx doesn't do it himself. You'd have to take the different bits and then go, well, this is an element of this, and this forms into this overarching picture. And for me, I'm just really trying to element that it is just certainly for me the case that non-domination is one element of what Marx means by freedom. I think there's just so many textual locutions that make that very obviously the case. Now, when it comes to positive, I suppose, positive freedom can mean different things, right? So it can mean there's the one kind of very internal, somewhat relation where it's, just about your self-fulfillment, self-realization, are you a flourishing individual and so forth, right? And this, I think, we've had this account of Marx quite a lot, and I just wanted to, let's say, provide a different aspect to what we might be seeing there. I think there is a question about, however, a political conception of positive freedom, which is, I think, what you're talking about a bit more in your book, if I'm right. And there, I think if I remember rightly in your book, you also make a good point there that when these, let's say, 18th, 19th century thinkers are, they're often political pamphleteers, they're giving speeches and so forth. They're not concerned with whether they fit into our neat little bit boxes of whether this is a negative or a positive conception. And so in some sense, there's always a danger of imposing things that might have been for them just, well, okay, freedom means democracy, means popular sovereignty. That's just what I'm going to say in my speech in the 1848 Parliament, right? And then I hope that I don't do violence to that historical record in that way, but I think you're right to point out that there is some multiplicity there. And then you asked a little bit more again on this question of freedom as non-domination. So I think you very nicely stress in your book the extent to which earlier republicanism had really thought that the freedom of some relied on the unfreedom of others. And so that in order to be independent, you needed others who were dependent on you, who were your servants, whether your wives, your workers, your personal servants, and so forth. And how does that then relate to Marx? Well, I think that in a similar way to democracy, I think that for him, it just becomes, in the way that is the grand contribution of the French Revolution, that freedom becomes universalized to be an acceptable ideal to Marx and Republicans. And so I think that, so he obviously believes that everyone deserves to be independent of each other. And then you're right to pick up to be independent, I prefer non-dominated, I suppose, because I think independent gets us down a confusing track, I suppose. Linguistically, of course, we can argue what the sources might say is more helpful. But I think that you're right to pick up that there is a sense in which the 19th century Republicans have a very strict understanding of what independence might mean. They think that each of us needs to be our own work for ourselves, self-employment. Alexandra, I think I am rambling a little bit more. Shall I speed up a little bit, because I've still got Nicholas's points here?
Yeah, soon you can finish and move on to Nicholas. But I think at the moment I don't see any questions from the audience. So,
Okay, well, so I think that's what I would say on the positive on the independent side. Let me finally move on to your final question, Geneviève, about things that didn't come up so much and Republican ideas or non-Republican ideas that could have been discussed more in the book. And so first was this idea that labor contributes to the realization of the self. And so there I fully agree. I think that's something that Marx changes his mind on. I think that in the very earliest writings, we get an account of the intrinsic value of political participation. He says that you are cut off from the air when you do not have no access to politics. He clearly thinks it's an element of one's self-flourishing. And then he really, I think, quite explicitly in 1844 rejects that view. And I talk a little bit about that in his relationship to Arnold Ruger. And he says that actually the far greater form of alienation is alienation from your labor rather than alienation from politics. And that's a view that he never really goes back on, even when in his later, more radical Republican phase in front of the Paris Commune. I think that is just a way in which he is different from at least one understanding of what republicanism means. He thinks that labor is more important than politics to your self-realization. And that way, I think we might argue about that, but I think in some ways it's a more democratic conception of self-realization, in some ways, at least the ways that has often been interpreted. And then when it comes to public education, you asked why, what couldn't there have been more? And I think you're completely right. I think if one were to write like a pure history of 19th century republicanism, education would be really up there as to one of the things they really care about. And I mention it as an element of the Republican constellation, but I focus on it less because it's a little bit less of Marx's concern. As I mean, he certainly, there are lines every now and again where he talks about the importance of education, of freeing us from kind of an ideological or spiritual domination, but it's somewhat marginal to his thought. And that's why it doesn't play as big a role. So I tried to tell a story of 19th century republicanism that was accurate, but I think it's somewhat inevitable going to be a little bit distorted by the subject focus and relationship to Marx as well. All right, now let me move on to Nicholas, and I'll try not to ramble too much this time. So I wanted to say that I completely share Nicholas's opening remarks about, the importance of academic freedom and how great it is that the CEO who is hosting this after the oppression and government oppression that they had faced by the Orban government. It's a reminder, of course, like my book talks a little bit about this in the way that Marx himself had an academic career closed to him because of the Prussian crackdown on young Hegelian thought. And Nicholas highlighted also his exile in London as well. All right, and so Nicholas had 3 points. The first was about the relationship between communism and republicanism. The second was about these 3 levels of domination. And the third was about constitutionalism. So let me talk first about this communism and republicanism. So I fully agree, and I really like the way that Nicholas set it up, that in a way, when it comes to communism and republicanism don't necessarily disagree conceptually or normatively at the ground level. They have a difference in social theory. That's certainly the way I would agree with that. I think it was a nice way to set it up. And then I think Nicholas pushed me a little bit more on what is the relationship here between alienation and domination. And I think I might need to come a little bit back to you on some of this, on some of these more conceptual points. Partly also because I cannot read my handwriting, and that is always a problem. I think I'll ask, so maybe in your response, Nicholas, if you could maybe slightly clarify what the question about alienation and domination, or maybe if you want to do that now quickly, and then that might be the best way to do it, Alexandra.
Yeah,
Yes.
so the question is simply, do you think that alienation figures as a critical category in Marx's writings independently of freedom?
Yeah, I guess I suppose it does, insofar as I don't think every time that he is talking about alienation in the early manuscripts that is always a claim about freedom. In the same way, I guess, you could argue that is also true of domination. It's not always automatically tied to freedom either. But maybe I'm not fully I'm getting that point, Nicholas.
The passage you cite in from the economic philosophical manuscripts suggests that freedom is a necessary condition for, even not just freedom generically, freedom as domination. But anyway, let's move on. We can talk about this later, especially given what the audience might want to talk about as well.
Sure. Yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about these 3 levels of capitalist domination. And so I really empathized with you, the point you raised that you were disappointed to find that suddenly after agreeing so much that then there's this bit about impersonal domination. So what do I say about this? Well, I kind of agree with your point that there's a question. You said that it does seem that Marx is sometimes saying this, right? In that some of the passages do suggest something like this, but that is an incoherent idea, you say, and we should not, attribute it to him. And so there's one thing I would say is about, I guess, again, maybe a little bit in what I was saying to Genevieve, there's different kinds of history of political thought, of course, one can do, right? There's the kind of more reconstructive aspects, which is kind of, well, really well, I don't think that that is the right idea, but I want to extract the most interesting idea out of it, right? Or the most accurate or something like that. And then there's the kind of more, well, this is what the texts say, as it were. So I guess that would be my first defense, a line of defense that, I think it just is the case that sometimes Marx talks about it in these ways. And I don't think he uses the phrase impersonal ever. I think you might be right about that. I mean, he certainly talks at one point in the French edition of Capital talks about domination personnelle, I think. So he talks about personal domination, which suggests that there might be an obverse of it. And there's certain, I mean, just suggests it, Nicholas, perhaps, right? And then there's I think and then there's plenty of other phrases that he uses. So he's very keen on this phrase that he says that there's two French proverbs that that and the modern form of it is that money has no master, right? And that again, that kind of language suggests this. But I think the more serious question is about how do we conceptualize this market domination correctly, right? That is, I think, the interesting question. I guess what I was trying to do in the book, and I think that that is an important question, is that I'm not 100% sure how much we can do that without reconstructing Marx, as it were, if that makes sense. So I think that we're then doing the next step of conceptual work about how exactly we should understand personal domination, impersonal and impersonal domination, which is, I think, what you do, really excellently in your book. And I agree with you with some of the kind of incoherent ways in which it has been phrased or put in previous versions in the Marxist tradition, and I much prefer some of the ways that you do so. But I think that, I guess I'm wary of using Marx as the battering stick to win the argument a little bit on that front. Does that make sense? And then on the final point about constitutionalism, so I fully agree, that I'm glad that that came across about the way in which Marx is committed to the universal suffrage and representation across his life. And then I thought it was interesting that you said, about this restricting suffrage question about whether Lenin might be wrong. So this really got me thinking again. It was a long time since I've read State and Revolution, and I really should read it again. But my memory of it had been that Lenin at least was quite accurate about his interpretations of the institutions that Marx was endorsing. Relatively in his commentary on the text. And my interpretation had been, as a result of that reading, which is quite a while ago, that Lenin's problem was more a problem of implementation, that he had accepted when he writes the text that these institutions are all necessary, and then when he takes power, they suddenly fall out of the window. But then I'm quite interested to hear what you think if that is actually not, if actually we should go back to that text and he's missing key things. So you mentioned particularly suffrage, and this would be interesting for me to check up on again, because the Soviet Union does at one point actually remove suffrage from capitalists, and they have some difficulty defining who that might be. And that, I think you're right. I think that that is just a complete innovation on their part that has just no grounding in Marx's writings for sure. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that on Lenin as well.
Great, thank you so much. We do have one question that we can now move on. I think then also like a larger discussion. This discussants also have maybe further questions based on what Bruno mentioned. But I have one question. Could you expand on what debates within Marxian exegesis were the most difficult to engage with within your text? What's left unanswered in your book, Bruno?
Oh, those are difficult questions, Alexandra. So the first was what was the most difficult for me to engage in, and the second was what is left unanswered. Well, I mean, without a doubt, the most difficult was trying to read the Young Hegelians. That was something I did out of historical necessity, not out of my own personal joy or interests, I have to say, because I knew that this is very important to understanding Marx's thought, and had not, yeah, and so The German word is Qual, so I really it was a difficult thing to put myself through. I mean, maybe I'm being harsh on them. To be fair, they had to write under censorship, and they had to write under, it was not always easy to say what they actually meant. But I found that a challenge for sure. The second
We are thankful that you read the young Hegelians for us.
Yeah, now no one
Oh,
else has to do it. Although I feel there'll be some people who might watch this who are huge fans of some of them, and I'm sorry to disappoint those huge fans. It's not my cup of tea, but maybe it's for others, right? Um, on the second one was what is unanswered in the book? Well, I feel like then I'm just giving ammunition to my critics because I'm just giving them the attack lines almost. But what is unanswered? Um, I think that I could have written a little bit more about internationalism and how that is different between Marx and Republicans. So Republicans really have this kind of somewhat patriotic view of, everyone has their own republic and you're a citizen of that republic, and that's your first kind of commitment. And Marx kind of completely abandons that and has a kind of international solidarity among the working class. The worker has no fatherland is the line from the manifesto. And I think that those are quite different. And yet there's some similarities because in the ways they actually end up organizing themselves in the International Working Men's Association, it's quite similar to previous Republican models that Mazzini and so forth had done, or at least there's a relation. So I think that there's an element of internationalism that I didn't talk about in the book. That's certainly something I would talk about. This is one for Marx geeks. I think I should have talked a little bit more about Belgium. I think that there's three formative influence that Lenin talked about and that Nicholas criticized. One thing it also misses out is that Marx spends an exile in Belgium from 1845 to 1848, and it's actually a really important exile, and no one is excited about Belgium generally, or when it comes to Marx scholarship. And yet, Belgium is where he writes what we now call the German ideology. I think it's where he formulates all kinds of really interesting ideas, and I think it's also there's a Republican story there because I think that he also he leads both the Democratic Association in Brussels, this Republican grouping, and a workers grouping, the Communist League. And so I think that there's a lot more detailed biographical and like work that could be done on that period that my book deals with, but I would have liked to have maybe done it more specifically, I suppose. But that's really a Marx geek answer. I don't know how many other people really think that that is what is missing in the book. And I don't know, I can't remember who said it, but it would have been a lot. It's already a long book, too long, and I don't know if it needed to be even longer.
Yes, I think this question is also more about further research down the road, or like if we have any students, great, tips for thesis topics from that point of view.
Well, I mean, I do think that someone could write Citizen Engels as well. That is certainly a sequel that someone out there could do.
Great tips here. Okay, we have another question. Ben Russell asks, Bruno, I really enjoyed the book. My question is, how do you hope that this book will help clarify the current neo-Republican positions in relation to the specific harms of capitalism? I'm thinking specifically on the questions of universal property, workplace democracy, voiced by example Christian Chamot. I think identifying the freedom infringing nature of the capitalist market is key for current left-wing politics being centered on the politics of freedom. Thank you, Ben, for the question.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, that's a great question then. So what do I think it adds to these contemporary neo-Republican debates? I mean, maybe I just want to quickly go back to what Geneviève was saying, because she had also raised its relation to, I think some neo-Republican things that get missed out. So I do think that I hope it provides us a bit more of an accurate history of what republicanism is. So there's, I think, as Geneviève has argued, French republicanism doesn't get much of a show in neo-republicanism at all. And I think that's a total historical mistake. And I think it's true of 19th century Republicans. So I'm certainly trying to do something there. And that's on the, let's say, the chronological narrative. And then I guess I do hope it provides a resource in terms of what Republicans should think about capitalism. I mean, I'm not sure how much I care about what Republicans should think, as insofar as, in all due respect to my fellow Republican academics, we are a small group of people in an academic setting. I care a little bit more about what it might mean outside of that, and that I care about what it means to socialists and anti-capitalists. And there, I think I think that this language of freedom as non-domination can be really helpful to articulating what is wrong with capitalism, or one wrong at least of capitalism, one very important wrong, and perhaps for me, I think it's also a bit of an explanatory wrong for the other wrongs. So I really share Nicholas's view that domination is what I don't know how if I don't know how well, I'm going to try and phrase it, but is the kind of explanation for exploitation or enables exploitation. I think Nicholas, you might want to correct me there on the conceptual front, but I think that as the kind of explanandum for this very important thing that happens in capitalism and what is wrong and unjust about it. And I think that is missing in neo-Republican debates. I think, I mean, I really love Philip Pettit's work. There's no doubt about it, but he has a different view about markets and capitalism, which is a more social democratic view, we might say. And sometimes even, I think he has a paper on freedom in the market, which I think he takes a very different view about what kind of role freedom in the markets can have. And so I hope that it provides it. I guess I hope it adds to what a bunch of other really great scholars who have been a bit more, we might call them left Republicans, socialist Republicans, people like Nicholas, people like Tom O'Shea, Keith Brean. There's so many names, I don't want to forget anyone by starting to name them, who've also done this really important work to point out that, well, domination isn't just political, there is also a social side to domination. And maybe my book, I think, provides I think that there's three faces of domination or three levels of domination that Nicholas referred to. I hope that is quite a nice comprehensive framework to understanding the different aspects of domination in capitalism from this Republican point of view. Maybe Nicholas and I can quibble about how we exactly define impersonal domination, but I do think that is a helpful framework. And that was a very long answer again to Ben's very easy question.
No, but that was a great answer because we have another question, which is related to your final thought. Kristina Basic is asking, thank you for the panel. Congratulations on a great book, Bruno. I was just wondering whether what you mean by impersonal domination might be better construed as structural domination.
Right. So I didn't catch this person's name. Was it? Oh, you're on mute, Alexandra.
Kristina Basic, apologies if mispronounced. Not sure if there are any signs missing on the name.
All right, so so I'm not sure that I would say that there's a difference between impersonal and structural domination. I think I'm a little bit following the literature as it's developed, insofar as I think Alex Gurevich was the first person to kind of really introduce the structural domination idea. At least that's my understanding. And then Will Roberts later came with impersonal domination and related that to markets. I find that maybe just linguistically, it's made more sense for me to understand structural domination in relationship to this specific feature of capitalism that workers don't own means of production, and capitalists do. And that means that workers have to sell their labor, and so they have to sell themselves to a master, if not any particular master, to use the kind of Marxian language around it. And I've always understood that seems to me to make sense in terms of structural domination. It seems to be a structure, as well, that explains that. And somehow for me, and this might just be really purely linguistic and rhetorical rather than a deep down conceptual difference, it seems somehow to call market domination structural domination has not fitted as well as the idea of impersonal domination. Because, I mean, maybe we can go back here a little bit to what Nicholas was saying about it. I mean, I agree that, there can be, is impersonal a right way to articulate what is wrong with market domination? I mean, I agree with Nicholas that there is a point also that impersonal can be good sometimes, right? It's certainly, I'd rather live as owner of my capitalist commodity of my labor power rather than being in a feudal setting, for sure. And I don't necessarily, I mean, there are some, I'm rambling, so let me be specific. I think that there are some formulations of impersonal domination that I think are slightly wrong-headed. So I don't think it is a big problem that we are subjected to other people's consumer choices, for instance. That is not impersonal domination to me. I agree with Nicholas there, and I think that's what he was getting at. And I don't think that's really what Marx was concerned about. I think he was concerned about the fact that in capitalism there is this force, this market imperative to produce as cheaply as possible that everyone is subjected to, and it's hard to reduce that to any single person who is creating that. Of course, it's the agglomeration of whatever demand and so forth that creates that force, and that force then is somehow separate. And he sometimes talks about it as if it is almost like a living being in his early writings, right? Is it right to call that impersonal or not? I mean, I'm not sure. I'd be interested to hear Nicholas's view on that. I guess I think I guess I land on it because William Quayle Roberts uses that language. It seemed to me quite accurate to the way that Marx sometimes talks about it, and it seems to get at something that is accurate about it in the sense that it is very obvious when you are fired by your individual employer that you are subjected to that bit of personal domination. You can identify who did that, right? That makes sense linguistically to me. And then, whereas, let's say, for instance, if you are a capitalist employer or even a worker-owned cooperative, and you're saying we want to reduce our work hours or something like that, but we can't because we're subjected to this arbitrary power of the market that stops us from making that decision, that seems to be, in some sense, a more impersonal force that is carrying out that domination. So that's why I use that language. This has gotten a little bit off Christine's exact point about structural and personal, but maybe it's a way to try and get back a little bit towards Nicholas's earlier points, which I don't think I adequately answered in our first exchange.
No, thank you. Yeah, I think it's good to like reflect on your use of terminology. Is there anything, Nicholas, you would like to add?
Well, if I may, so my beef was not only that the notion of impersonal domination it's the grammar of domination can't withstand it. It's logically incoherent to think that there can be dominatorless domination, that the capitalists as a class even are somehow dominated by the imperative to maximize profit and minimize cost. They're not dominated, they're just subject to it. But the same way that a prison guard is subject to prison structure without being unfree, capitalists are subject to capitalist structure without being unfree. So what we have when we're talking about impersonal domination is an abuse of words, an abuse of logic. But not only that, I think Marx cannot possibly think anything in the vicinity of the Roberts, Postone, Heinrich idea about impersonal domination, because he thinks that the sheer impersonality of markets is what liberates humanity from the vicissitudes of feudalism. So market relations as such are a perfectly egalitarian system. It's the realm of freedom, equality, property, and Bentham, as the old man says in chapter 6 of volume 1 of Capital. It's perfectly good, perfectly fine. What comes after it, which is the hidden abode of production, is what screws everything up. But you can have the former without the latter, and that was my beef with the idea that there is impersonal domination. We can stop at structural domination, and then we have all we need. So that's a comment on the impersonal issue. And just if I may, on the Lenin issue, Lenin says explicitly, so the misinterpretation is much worse. So he says, I just picked it up now, he says explicitly in The State and Revolution, he criticizes Kautsky and others, and he says explicitly, they themselves share and instill into the minds of people the false notion that universal suffrage in the present day state is really capable of revealing the will of the majority of the working people and of security, its realization. So it actually, the first part of The State and Revolution explicitly contradicts what Marx says about universal suffrage, and it's his defense of it.
Can I come back on that, Alexandra?
Yes.
So that's really interesting, Nicholas. I'm wondering, I guess it depends a little bit on what Lenin means by in its present state, right? Does he mean there like, universal suffrage as it's, let's say, developing or slowly developing in Germany, which doesn't have, let's say, any of those institutional safeguards that Marx is talking about? Or is he making a rejection of universal suffrage as such?
He leaves it unqualified in just the previous sentence. He says, he criticizes the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks and says, expects this more from universal suffrage, full stop. The implication being they shouldn't expect that from universal suffrage. That's mine too. That's how I read this. I mean, I don't know what, yeah.
Nice. Well, just to come back on the personal domination, but so you put a lot of stress on the fact that this impersonal domination makes just doesn't make any linguistic grammatical sense, right? In it. But then what do you make of the fact that, I mean, there's just undoubtedly the case that Marx does use domination in this way. He says that we are beherrscht, dominated by these market forces repeatedly in Capital, right? So he is using that language there.
Well, but there are other readings available. So you don't, it seems to me like a bad inference to go from this is personal domination, this isn't personal domination, therefore it must be impersonal. I think there's a space between the two, which is captured by structural. It's not personal, but it's not impersonal. It's just we creating institutions which enslave and dominate some people, just as we create prisons. But again, prison guards aren't unfree. They're subject to the constraints of prisons, but they're not unfree. Capitalists are subject to the constraints of capitalism, but they're not unfree. And you might speak allegorically or whatever, and Marx sometimes talks as if, you know, capitalists are enslaved or unfree, but he wobbles. And so I think, you know, given the logical problems there, and given also that saying that capitalists are dominated is to throw out the baby with the bathwater, because it's effectively to say, oh yeah, poor capitalists, they're dominated. I think the overall balance of considerations as a matter of Marxian exegesis tells more in favor of just trying to explain what he's trying to do there as a structural notion, as opposed to some impersonal notion which he never mentions and which seems like a really bad, really bad social theory.
Can I come to the difference here of impersonal domination? Because I didn't find that problematic. So I understand, Nicholas, that you're arguing that, but I really see this notion. I think it's not just in Marx. I think actually it's in Rousseau. And I mean, you don't talk a lot about Rousseau, Bruno, in your book, but there are many conceptions that he really takes from Rousseau, and I think this is one of them. So what I understand is that, so you, with Rousseau, and then Marx picks that up, when you are in the relations of dependence between two individuals, of course, there's someone who has the upper hand, and so there's someone who dominates the other. But the one who is dominated, when the other becomes dependent on it, is also dominated in a certain way because of the relationship of dependence in which they are being kind of together. And of course, this becomes important in Hegel. But then there's this extra thing that Rousseau develops, and I think Marx, I mean, I'm just repeating things that Bruno said, but so when there are objects that are created in the world through technological change, and these objects that are created by the will, so they are people who are willing and who are agents, then they escape the will, right? So they are these creations that are not natural. They are not objects of nature. They're objects out of the will. Nicholas says, yes, yeah. But then, you know, they escape the person who willed. And so once this escapes the person who wills, these things take their logic of their own that is outside the personal will. Now, these things dominates, I think, dominates the person who will, and the kind of descendants of them, because they are not from nature. They are objects of human will, but they escape the person who willed. And so if they escape the person who will, then the people who are constrained to them, so that their freedom is constrained by them, they're not constrained by nature. They are constrained by the objects of the human will, escape, except there is no, you cannot identify just one person who willed. And Rousseau says that clearly about early political economy, about the fact that objects and the logic of technology comes to dominate us. But Marx also says that. So I don't understand why this is bad logic. You can totally have, you can totally be dominated even if you cannot say, here is the dominator. Just like, you know, you can see people who are who die from like fentanyl use or you know, different, and you cannot say, okay, here's the person who murdered them, but certainly you can sort of trace their death to kind of larger structural causes that escape the will of the people who caused it. So I don't understand why you cannot call that impersonal domination. And Bruno, am I correctly? So I don't understand why this is not correct.
So this is about structure, right? So the thought there is that, of course, structures confer the ability on some groups of people to dominate, but structures as such can't dominate anyone. Prisons don't dominate. They confer on some people the ability to dominate others. But the sheer fact that a prison has a certain structure doesn't mean anything for the unfreedom of the prison guard as opposed to the unfreedom of the prisoners. That's so the sheer fact that something is beyond your control, beyond anyone's control, we create it, but we don't control it, doesn't entail anything of significance as I see it in terms of who dominates whom.
Okay, I mean, I'm happy there we have this engagement. We don't have actually a question from the audience. We have still a little bit of time. I was thinking to just ask one small question from Bruno, also because at Review of Democracy, we are also hoping to, sometimes make some scholarly debates more accessible for the public. So definitely our, audience is coming both from scholarly community and more like educated readers. And I was wondering, because of course, for public, often Marx is a thinker of equality. So that's usually the first association. But obviously here we are putting freedom into the focus. So do you think, or are you hoping also maybe that the book, when it reaches also like, maybe some public discussions, is that something that you would try to change into a thinker of freedom, or is that still, sort of comes hand in hand?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I think I think it's just undoubted for me that freedom is Marx's central political value, and it's not equality. I mean, he has very specific criticisms of equality in his, let's say, critique of the Gotha program. You could argue that he has a somewhat simplistic conception of what equality means, basically meaning equal property holdings or something like that. And Marx is totally against that and just think that that doesn't make any sense because people have different needs, and so forth. But in any case, the value that he just appeals to again and again is freedom. And he says, I think in his early writings, that freedom is the essence of man at some point, right? And that everyone believes in freedom, just some people don't believe in freedom for all. I'm paraphrasing what is a very beautiful quote in my much less elegant language than what Marx uses to say it. But in those, and that's just something that he commits to throughout. And I like to think that of his project is very much an idea of how can you actually overcome what he thinks a dominating system in various different ways that we've talked about today and how we might characterize that. But I think it's in some way dominating, and that we might instead have a free society, which would be a socialist society, and that would be very different to what has sometimes been understood, including in the country that CEU used to call home as well. And that I think he meant something, a truly free society, both politically and socially as well.
Great, thank you. So we don't have any more questions from the audience. Maybe I would ask any final remarks from the discussants.
May I ask, Bruno, in your response to Genevieve's question about the tyranny of the majority, doesn't Marx's early discussions of Athenian democracy and his critique, his Hegelian take on Athenian democracy as the enslavement of individuality and so on, isn't that the beginning of something like a critique of the tyranny of the majority in Marx's work?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about it in that way, but you could certainly, I mean, there's something there that he criticizes, as you say, as much as he's positive about these old Greek examples and Athenian examples, he also thinks that people were somehow too enveloped in this, in the public sphere as well. And there wasn't specific space for individual rights as well. So he thinks that is an achievement of modernity. So he has a Hegelian view of that a little bit as well. And that would be, I guess, a certain protection against tyranny of the majority as well. I mean, the other thing maybe I could have mentioned is that I think it's also true that in Marx's early writings, he's very critical of Robespierre and the Terror. And that's something that's not, he never actually, he has very critical views of the Jacobins throughout, actually, which in some ways makes him different to, let's say, Republicans in the 19th century who have a much more positive view. And I think Marx actually sides with, let's say, probably the very left of the revolution, which is sometimes forgotten, perhaps. That, I mean, I'm rambling again, but maybe Geneviève, might have something to say about that. But yeah, so I think that this I think Nicholas, you're right. There might be some resources there in his kind of view of the Athenian things, and also his critique of the Jacobins as well.
Great. I don't know if Geneviève, you have anything to add to this or any final comments? No. Okay. Then
I think this is a wonderful book, and I really recommend it highly to the audience.
Well,
Great.
I also want to plug, I also think that Nicholas and Genevieve's books are also fantastic works. And, I think Nicholas's book came out just before mine came out, just before I was finishing the manuscript. And I engaged a little bit with it, but my book would have been better if I'd really been able to fully engage with it before finishing the manuscript. And Genevieve's came out after my book. And I think I would also have been greatly aided had it come out before. So I just want to just plug also their two books for people to look at. I think they are just fantastic pieces of work of political theory and history of political thought as well. I'm so grateful to both of you for taking the time today.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone who joined us today for this engaging discussion. Thank you for the audience for being so active. Special thanks to Bruno for sharing his work, and to our discussants, Geneviève and Nicolas, for their reflections. If you enjoyed today's discussion, I can also just encourage you to pick up a copy of Citizen Marx, and of course also follow the Review of Democracy for more discussions, podcasts on democracy, politics, and history. Thank you and goodbye. And thank you again for the panel for joining and for your time and efforts.